Hello, and welcome to Photography Tips. And we're starting a new series about photographing the basics. And today we're going to talk about shutter speed. And below there, you see some photographs with their corresponding shutter speeds listed. And shutter speed is a very important concept in photography. If you want to master photography, you have to understand shutter speed and understand how to use that. And before I go in depth on shutter speed, I want to let you know a little bit about me and what my credentials are as a photographer. First off, my name is Pasquale Mingarelli. My friends call me Pat, and I have a number of different websites, and two of them are listed there. One is wildheartphotography.com. If you go there, you'll see a number of my galleries. Most of them are nature galleries, but there's also sports and portraits and journalism and other forms of photography. The other website there is listed there as visualverse.thecreationspeaks.com. If you go to that website, I post a photo a day there. It's always a nature photo, and I post one every day. There are hundreds of photographs on there, and there's blogs on there and things like that. So you can go and check that out if you get some time. And some more about my career. I went to school at Bowling Green State University in Ohio and got a degree in photojournalism. From there, I started working for a newspaper for a short time before I got hired on by an organizational magazine called Worldwide Challenge. It was a small magazine, but it was a great magazine to work for. I got to travel overseas and around the country and got to take lots of pictures, meet lots of great people, and things like that. But eventually, I felt led to do freelance work. And when I started freelance work, I also started teaching photography. I teach at two different community colleges as well as some other locations. And one of the things I teach about is shutter speed. Again, shutter speed is a very important concept that someone needs to master in order to become a good photographer. Shutter speed is an exposure control tool. That means it's one of the controls we have on our cameras if we're using a digital SLR camera or a digital single lens reflex camera. If you're using that, you have a number of different exposure controls, and shutter speed is one of them. And what an exposure is, it's just allowing light to hit our sensor in our camera, which ultimately takes the picture because we expose that sensor to light and make an exposure. Now, shutter speed, we may ask the question, though, so what does shutter speed mean anyway, and how does that work? And what shutter speed is, the quick definition of that is just the amount of time, the length of time, I should say, that the shutter remains open. And when it's open, it allows light to pass through the sensor and thus making an exposure. And if we decrease or increase that time the shutter is open, we allow more or less light in, and we control the amount of light coming in with our shutter speed. Therefore, it helps control our exposure. Now, that shutter speed is represented by various numbers, and this leads to our next question: what do the numbers mean? Well, I'm going to pull up some of those numbers here, and the highest number we're going to come up to here today is 2000. Although most DSLR cameras go higher than that, we're going to use that number just because it kind of fits nicely on our screen. And what do these numbers mean? What do they represent? What does 1000 represent, or 500? Well, what these numbers represent are actually fractions of a second. So 2000 is 1/2000th of a second. 1000 is 1/1000th of a second. 500 is 1/500th of a second, and so on down the line. And now when we look at these numbers, we do find an interesting relationship. We don't we? It kind of pops out at us. And well, obviously 1000 is half of 2000, and 500 is half of 1000, and 250 is half of 500, and again, so on down the line. And what that relationship is that if we go from 1/2000th of a second down to 1/1000th of a second in our shutter speed, we're actually doubling the amount of time that our sensor is exposed to light. And if we go from 1000 to 500, we're again doubling the amount of time our sensor is exposed to the light, because 500th of a second is twice as long as 1,000th of a second. And if we move down to 2/50th of a second, again, that's twice the length of time 250 is of a 2/50th of a second is to a 500th of a second. So we're doubling the amount of light that's coming into our sensor to help us make a picture. And we control this depending on, how dark it is or how much light we need to take our picture. So we either speed up or slow down our shutter speed. It's like, I like to look at shutter speed as a parallel I like to draw in my classes that helps my students understand is I like to draw a parallel with a traffic signal. If the highway engineers or the town engineers want to get more cars through a traffic light, say that traffic light is green for 30 seconds, but they want to double the amount of cars that get through that traffic light, what they will do is they can extend that to a minute. So now that cars have twice as long to get through the light, just as when we go from 500th of a second to 2/50th of a second, the light has twice as much time to get to our sensor. Now, when we continue to look at these, if we'll go from 250 to 125, 60th, all of them, again, it's a half number, 30th of a second, then down in the second row, 15th of a second, 8th of a second, quarter of a second, then we have 2 seconds, and then we hit that 1. That's a magic number because that's a transition number, because we're no longer talking about fractions of a second. We are talking about full seconds. So that's 1 second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 8 seconds, 15 seconds, and 30 seconds. Most digital single lens reflex cameras, you can set them to take a picture for 30 seconds. Now, when you're doing this, you would have to have a tripod and use a cable release or some sort of remote to set off your camera, because the tripod would steady that camera and hold it still. You certainly couldn't hold the camera still for 30 seconds. And then the cable release will allow you to keep your hands off it. So, because if you touched it, you might make the camera shake a little bit and blur the image. So if you have a cable release, you press the shutter via the cable release and you take your picture. Now, 30 seconds is not the end. We can actually take longer pictures. We can take them for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour if the conditions are right. And the way we do that is we use a setting called bulb. Or you may see a B in your camera. What that does, that bulb setting allows us to take a photograph for an indefinite amount of time. And the way you do, again, you're using your cable release or your remote, and you press your cable release, the shutter release on your cable release, which opens up the shutter, but then you lock it. There's usually a locking mechanism on a cable release that allows you to take a picture for whatever length of time you determine without overexposing your photograph. And the term bulb comes from back in the day, back in the middle of the 19th century, when photography was just kind of beginning to grow. The shutters operated by air pressure. There was a hose connected to the camera, and that obviously that hose had air in it, and on the end of that hose was a bulb, and the photographer would squeeze the bulb, and that would release the shutter. And when the photographer released the bulb, the shutter would come back down into place. So that's where the setting bulb is, and that's how they used to take pictures years ago, like this photograph taken by William Henry Jackson of the Yellowstone River in Yellowstone National Park. He used a camera that most likely had a bulb on it. And that photograph exposure is probably, maybe 2 or 4 seconds based on the water, just looking at it like that. Where some pictures took 5 minutes, especially in a studio, and they would hold that bulb or they would clamp it down and to take the photograph as long as they needed to take it. So that's where we get the word bulb from. Next, I want to talk about is some other numbers that we see when we look at the shutter speeds on our camera, and we'll bring in those numbers right here. And when I learned photography, it was really easy to learn it mathematically because we had just those big black numbers that you see there. Because I learned back in the film days, and we were only using those kind of shutter speeds. But today we have what's called thirds of stops in our shutter speed, and those numbers, those new red numbers that I just pulled in there, Those are known as thirds of stops, because when we look at the 2000 and the 1000 there, the difference between them photographically is known as a stop. A stop of light is either half the amount of light or twice the amount of light. When a photographer says, when a photographer needs to cut down his light, they may say you have to stop down one stop, and that would mean going from 500 to 1000, because that would be letting in half the amount of light. When we stop down one stop, we let in half the amount of light. When we open up a stop, we allow twice as much light in. Or if you open up two stops, you're letting 4 times as much light in. So you'd go from 500 to 125. That would be 2 stops of light, the difference there. So when we look at 2000 and 1000, that's 1 stop of light. But now we have these 2 other numbers added in there, 1600 and 1250, and that divides the difference between 2000 and 1000 into thirds. So therefore, they are known as thirds of stops. Now, when we continue down these lines, there's something else I want to point out. If we look at 15th of a second, 1/8 of a second, 1/4 of a second, we also have 1/2 of a second. Now, that's what I learned when I was in photography. But today, our digital cameras kind of change that up, and they switch up and they go to 5. That looks confusing, but what that is it's turning it into into the decimal. So that's 0.5 or 1/2 a second. If we look at the numbers underneath, we also see those also are turned to decimals. We have 3/10 of a second, 4/10 of a second, and it goes to 5/10 of a second, which of course is a 1/2 second. And then we have 6.6 and 0.8 before we get to the 1 second. That can get a bit confusing as a new photographer, and it was for me when I've got my first camera that operated that way. I'm like, what happened to my 2? Why is it going 4, 3, 4? If you look at it as you're going through your camera, it seems like an odd way to count. It goes 4, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 1. So it's just kind of confusing. But when you understand that those numbers are tenths of seconds, it makes sense. And those tenths of seconds kind of extend down all the way to that 3.2. But once we get to the 4, it stays at actual seconds. We've got 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 8 seconds. So moving on, we want to talk about when to use what. And I'm going to explain this in another video. Our video is about 10 minutes long here. And I know when people I know for myself, when I see a 10-minute long video or a 15-minute long, I start getting not wanting to watch it. So I'm going to start a part 2, and we'll continue with shutter speed. Thanks a lot. And again, here's my website information. Thanks.